Welcome to another episode of the Future of Work webcast here on ChangeNerd. Thanks a lot for being with us today. Today we have a special guest. She's a super smart person and a good friend of mine, Becky Bryant. She is the Director of Professional Nursing Development at Rutgers, and she has her DNP, that's a doctorate in nursing and trauma-informed care. And Becky and I met when she was at Urban Promise, and we were talking a lot about this idea of resilience. And throughout our conversations here on the Future of Work webcast, we've been talking about the impact of change. And so I thought it would be awesome to bring an expert on to help us kind of sift through this idea of resilience and what's our responsibility as individuals and what can we do as organizations. So Becky, thanks for being with us here today.
I'm excited about the conversation.
Awesome.
So thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So we were just talking a little bit ago about this idea of resilience at work. And so maybe help us understand a little bit about why we need to be thinking about being more resilient nowadays with all of the stuff that's going on at work and outside of work.
Yeah. So if everybody doesn't understand, I find sometimes people don't really know exactly what the word resilience means. I think a great metaphor is a tennis ball bouncing back. It's this idea that you meet adversity, and we can't get through life without having stress and adversity at some point. And it's our ability to bounce back to the level that we can function well again, and then we can be healthy again. I do think that life has gotten increasingly complicated. I mean, with the addition of technology, how rapidly that's evolved, way faster than we humans evolved, and the complexity, the idea that I know very few people who, when they take a vacation, they're ever actually fully off and have true downtime. And then you add things like what's going on in the state of our nation, and you add climate change to that, and people are carrying around a lot of stress. And so, it's how do you get through it, and what keeps you strong, and how much should the workplace play a role in that?
Interesting. Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting way to think about it, because there are so many stressors that we kind of run into or maybe get run into in the world that we live in now. And so as we kind of think about this idea where we need to create environments, either we need to create them or we need help with them, where we have the opportunity to kind of increase the level of resilience that we have. What's our responsibility as workplaces to kind of set up environments where people can be more resilient?
Yeah. So I like looking at two different models when I think about this. One, as you said, my focus of my doctorate was to help organizations become trauma informed. And that recognizes that things that happen, particularly in childhood, have an effect on health and well-being across the lifespan. And it can also be trauma that happens in adulthood. And a lot of times what I'm talking about when I say trauma, it's relational trauma. It's trauma that happens in relationships as opposed to, say, an earthquake or something situational. And it really, it has a profound impact. And the model that comes to mind when I think about that is, it's actually the SAMHSA model, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration. It's a federal level government, but their baseline for an organization to be trauma informed is safety. And I think about this because we spend so many hours every week at work. Matter of fact, chances are we spend a lot more hours with our coworkers than we do with our loved ones. And if you don't feel safe with that person, or you don't feel safe in that environment, then what is that doing to your daily stress level on top of all the things that you're responsible for? And when you talk about safety in this model, you actually talk about a couple of different aspects. One, of course, is physical safety. And when I go around helping organizations become trauma informed, specifically, a lot of times I'm working with medical clinics that are in inner city settings and don't always feel safe. Um, that is a constant stressor in the back of your mind is, okay, who's going to walk through the door? I mean, especially in this era of increased gun violence, it's like, who's going to walk in? Who am I going to call? How am I going to react to that? And so you've got that physical safety concern. Then you've got emotional safety. Can I trust the person that I report to? Can I trust my coworkers that I can maybe vent a little and not get in trouble for it, not have it go right to the top, right? And bite me and, turn around and bite me. And then the third level of safety that I have seen play out is a sense of moral safety. Do I agree with the decisions that my company is making? Because I saw that play out in some of the nonprofits that I've been involved with, not always agreeing with how things were handled, whether it was with fundraising or telling people stories or yeah, do decisions that are made by leadership, do they sit well with people who are functioning day to day? So I often think of that. And then when I think about a resiliency model, my favorite model is the 7 C's of resiliency. And I'm not going to recite all 7 C's, but the number one C is connection. And it recognizes that we are biologically wired to be connected. That's how we evolved. That's how we survived not being eaten by saber-toothed tigers, because we gathered together, and that continues to be very, very necessary. It turns out that our relationships are what actually wire our brains and increase or decrease our ability to handle stress. So I think recognizing the importance of connection, and that means in a very busy work environment, somehow you're supposed to make time to maybe let people just connect with each other and get to know each other.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Those three levels are really fascinating to me, that sort of your physical safety, your psychological safety, and sort of the moral safety or moral connection with the organization. There's lots of work. When I was at Great Place to Work, there was all these studies about psychological safety and the connection between how psychologically safe someone felt and their ability to perform. And that's such a important sort of base level of a leader's ability to create an environment in which I feel comfortable to be myself.
Yes.
And it dawns on me as we think about connection, right? Those two things seem to really intertwine. That I know in many organizations, you're in back-to-back meetings, right? 8 hours a day and running from thing to thing and checking things on your phone and all that. And so the opportunity to make those connections are not available. And so, you are making decisions, you're interacting with people without understanding who they are or what makes them tick or any of those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I certainly know in an educational setting, if someone doesn't feel like they have a relationship with you, they're not going to learn from you. so, or at least it's not going to stick. And so I just think, yeah, I agree that this whole, we're seeing it in education, I think in purely online hybrid course or the hybrid courses. People don't have many opportunities to actually physically be in the room with one another, and so there's a lot of discussion of how do you create that on the internet, but it isn't the same as
No.
having time to connect.
No. And so when we think about enabling an environment and where people can increase the level of resilience, increase the level of connection, what are some things that you would suggest that an organization could do to just sort of make that more the norm?
Yeah. Well, first there has to be recognition of the need for this, right? It's really frustrating, and that's got to be from the top right down, which is a process. It's not a one-time recognition when you start talking about these things. Matter of fact, sometimes when you start talking about these things, they go, "Oh Lord, what? This is the latest hot, topic, and it's soft and wishy-washy, and really, what value is it going to be?" But again, I can I could geek out and explain neurologically why this makes a whole lot of sense. Um, but anyway, so it's this acknowledgement of it and embracing of it. And a lot of times when you're looking at change like this, it's really important to have champions of a, of an initiative. And my experience again has been you need champions at the leadership level, and also at the employee level, um, for it to make a difference. And then it is building in opportunities to actually connect with each other. So that might be taking a half day, and having some sort of laid back retreat where, it's just a get to know you, and maybe you're not allowed to talk about work at all. God, imagine that. And then affirmations are huge. So like taking the time to notice something little that somebody did.
Hmm.
And that can go both ways. That can go from, the employee to the leadership, and back down too. Acknowledging that in some way, because we do better when we're acknowledged. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel seen. I've read articles about organizations that someone will just spontaneously bring in some cookies for somebody because they really appreciated that day when they were having a terrible day and somebody covered for them, or but it's bringing intention to that, right? Yeah. And what we were talking a little bit about before too was that idea that so often, if we think about resilience at all, we tend to think it's an individual responsibility. Like, science does show that people are born with different levels of the ability to bounce back, but then it is something that we can learn too. And there are, like, it has to do with actually emotional intelligence and things like that, but there are things that you can learn, to improve your level of resiliency. But again, if you're only putting the impetus or on the individual, um, then it can feel like another thing on their to-do list. Like, I think of, self-care, right? And when you have somebody running like a chicken with their head cut off, but then you say, but you know what, you got to care for yourself, and they're just thinking, and when am I supposed to squeeze that in,
Right.
when you're sending emails right up to 11 o'clock at night, and then I got a kid and I got a house and I got, um, it can just feel like more pressure. And in fact, maybe self-care needs to be accounted for in the workplace to some degree, like as a part of supervision check-in, or and it can be facilitated. So it's hard to like write one, recipe for success for a given organization, but I think the importance is bringing awareness and encouraging conversation. um,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's
So
really powerful too, because I feel like what you're kind of pointing to is that there's this need, right, to just first of all make it sort of acceptable that we're having this conversation, and that it's an important thing, and that as an organization we're acknowledging that this is just as important as making sure that you get back to the customer and you work on your projects and all those kinds of things. It's one of those things that Stephen Covey talked a lot about, this idea of, you got to sharpen the saw and all that sort of thing.
mhm,
The other thing that makes me think about is that in organizations, it feels like there's a real opportunity to enable people or to encourage people to take the time, in their day to really think about their lives outside of work, uh,
mhm,
and to think about what that means and what that looks like. And I wonder though, because there's all at least when I hear on the news talk about like education and how every moment of the day is allocated to something. And like with the coronavirus now, they're even talking about, well, there's no time for extra hygiene because they've got all this time sort of
Yes, I heard that
mashed
this
in.
morning. Yes.
And I feel like it's that way at work as well. I mean, I remember not being able to take lunch because you're
Yeah.
just in back-to-back meetings.
Yeah.
And so what do you think about, or how would you sort of counsel an organization to begin to shift that conversation?
Yeah. Well, first off, I would explain a little bit the why. When you have people constantly running, constantly exhausted, constantly feeling pressured, and maybe not feeling safe or not even knowing who's working with them personally, then they are functioning out of survival mode.
Hmm.
And one of my favorite ways to illustrate this is the hand model of the brain, which comes from Dan Siegel. And this is the basement of your brain, the brain stem that controls things just like breathing and body temperature and digestion. And this is your reptilian brain, so that's going to move you out of the way if you're a horrible accident or something. This is your emotional brain, so you're always like functioning out of, your feelings are constantly hurt, your feelings are driving everything that you do. And then finally, this is your thinking brain, which is calm, right? And makes sense of it, interprets it, helps you pause and take a moment. The problem is our lower brains function way faster than our thinking brain functions. I think you taught me this. Our emotional brain travels like thoughts travel at 100,000 miles per hour, whereas calm, rational thinking only happens 120 to 140 miles per hour. And the problem is when we're upset at work or exhausted all the time, our lids flip and we're functioning out of either our emotional brain or out of our survival brain, right?
Interesting.
And this survival brain can override everything else if it thinks that you're threatened. And unfortunately, sometimes stress at work can trigger that deep survival mechanism. Or again, if you're constantly exhausted, if you feel like you're being put down, if you can't trust anyone, so you've got to watch your back all the time and you're wondering every meeting if someone's, going to take you down, then you are in survival mode. And guess what? Up here in the calm brain is where you retain new knowledge and where you process things and you make connections. And that's where the creativity is, right? And you're inhibiting that
Yeah.
when you have people constantly functioning out of survival brain.
Yeah.
So I've seen higher functioning organizations do things like, for instance, no emails after 7 o'clock at night. I don't care what's going on, because honestly, especially if it's on your phone, even if you say to yourself, I don't have to answer that, it's my bedtime. If you set your notifications on, you're still getting the notification, or better yet, turn off your notifications, after work. But if there's a cultural expectation that you're on 24/7, you're going to be more likely to be functioning out of your survival brain.
So
And then,
interesting.
yeah, so I mean, it just makes so much sense. We are limited human beings. We need rest. We need play, actually. We do so much better when we have opportunities to it. There's a guy, I work these pastor conferences, and there's a gentleman, Bob Stice, who talks about everyday resilience. And some components of that, what's the one I was thinking about? Actually, and this is by another guy I learned from this conference too. This idea of building in margin time into your day. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but the idea is that we need space between events to have room for if someone's running a little late, or what if you have to make a follow-up phone call, or what if you just need to sit down and take a few notes and process before you move to a new thing. I know when I learned about margin time, I had been running back to back to back to back meetings, and I was losing my mind all the time, and I was forgetting things, and I'd feel awful, and that would set me off. But when I started building in margin time, deciding that I could not schedule another meeting unless it was at least half an hour after the last one, preferably an hour, and I would actually limit the number of meetings per day, it gives a little bit of breathing room. And it's not the same, like vacation time's not margin time. Like,
Yeah.
it's just, it's allowing intentional space so that you've got a little wiggle room so that you're not constantly reacting, and you can build some proactivity into that.
Yeah.
Um,
That's interesting. It's so interesting because, so I've had conversations a little bit like this before about this idea of reflection, right? That one of the keys to being successful in the future of work is that margin time or reflection time, because we as human beings, we're not machines. So we're never going to be able to operate at the pace of a computer. But what we can do is we can see patterns and make connections and be innovative. But in order to do that, we have to have soak time for
yeah,
things to sort of percolate and sit together, and in the shower, or it's while we're sleeping or
yeah.
watching TV or whatever. And so, one of the things that brings to mind is this idea that, when I was a kid, we talked a lot about this, like when it's going to be like the Jetsons when we get older, and we're going to
Mhm.
have all this free time and be able to do all this stuff. And the opposites happened, in my
Yeah, the
opinion. Like,
opposites happened, exactly.
and so how do you think that sort of idea of the kind of shrinking time that we have to just sort of allow to reflect, or margin time, um, what does that do to the way that we operate?
Well, I think it makes you function much more often out of your survival brain, or your emotional brain anyway, because you're foggy and you're tired. You can't, and I think it limits creativity. I think they've been demonstrating that ever since cell phones came out, actually. And, and just as we're constantly on, we never have this downtime, and creativity is decreasing. And you see people, you see some people actually very intentionally getting off of all of social media and putting down their phones for significant periods of time, and taking retreats away from these things to try to encourage that part of the brain. I also don't think we connect as well with each other. They're starting to show that kids that have grown up with phones since birth, they don't make as much eye contact, and they don't have as many um, social manners, I guess, or being able to read a subtle situation as well, is beginning to be lost. And again, our brains are wired for survival, so we have a lot of nerve endings that are dedicated, neurons that are dedicated to watching how someone's body language is, what their facial expression is doing, what their chin muscles are doing, and so we're still having those below the level of consciousness reactions, but because we don't engage as thoughtfully or as calmly, I don't think we know what to do with them. And I think that's probably contributing to some of this added stress that we're seeing. And you don't see other countries doing this as much. So I have family in Germany, and in Germany, when you take vacation, like, and it's for like 6 weeks. Like you unplug and you go away, or you stay home, but you're not on your email, and they have figured out systems that someone else is covering.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know what it is about American culture that we're so driven to the point of insanity, but I know it doesn't work. It doesn't work with us biologically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And it kind of and then it permeates too, because I think that in every aspect of your life, you're always thinking about the place that you're not.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah,
you're never really completely present.
right.
So one of the other things that I think is really interesting, I know that we have had a lot of conversation about this sort of notion of being trauma informed, and all of the studies that how trauma impacts how we operate. And so one thing I'm kind of curious about is, as we think about sort of this world of being impacted by trauma. Um, I know that based on our conversations, it's not as infrequent as we would think it is. So maybe help us understand a little bit about uh, first of all, what what is how does trauma impact us, and then maybe a little bit about like the how often it happens, or how
How
frequent
common it
it,
is.
yeah, how common
Yeah,
it is.
yeah. Um, so with regard to childhood trauma, there have been there have been multiple studies, but two really major studies. The first one was done in the late 90s, and the last one was just done last year. Um, but it has, and the last one I think has irrefutable evidence. 200,000 participants looking at 10 different childhood traumas. It was across 23 different states, and it was a very diverse population. And it showed that at least 2/3 of Americans have had one trauma in their childhood. 40% have had two, and 12.5, 13% have had four or more. And if you're growing up in an area of either concentrated urban poverty or rural poverty, if you're a person of color, or if you identify as LGBTQ, then your risk for those individual relational traumas goes even higher, significantly higher, puts them at risk. Um, and so, and what they've shown is that these events that happen in childhood, which would seem like obvious things like physical, sexual, emotional abuse and neglect, but also household dysfunction, like living with someone who has substance abuse or mental illness, or someone who was incarcerated, or someone with mental illness, or losing a parent to divorce or separation. Um, you, I love that it looks at that household dysfunction too, because that actually creates toxic stress, which overwhelms coping mechanisms. And they've linked those events to brain development, to immune and hormone function, and actually even to genetic expression. And they're associated with 7 out of 10 leading causes of physical death in the United States. So things I used to treat as a nurse practitioner all the time: cardiac disease, COPD, any cancer, stroke, suicide rates really go up. So there's a big body of research that shows that. And I think then thinking larger than that, those original studies that have been done, which are limited, the best definition of trauma that I know of is anything that stuns you like a bolt out of the blue and disconnects you from your body. And that shows it can happen at any age, and that it's not so much what happens to you as how you experience it, because different things may stun different people. And it shows how common it is, because really, who hasn't had something that stunned them and stayed with them for years? It imprints on them, you know. And so one of my favorite quotes is actually, your lived experience becomes your biology. Now, where this intersects with the workplace and resilience, I think, is self-awareness. And it has to do with knowing, because of your lived experience, both good and bad, what are your triggers? And also, what are the things that get you through? And when you're able to name those, and especially if you're in an environment where it's safe enough to maybe speak a little bit to that in a responsible way, then you're talking holy next level of honestly, I think it fits very well into the model of emotional intelligence, because you've got that self-awareness, and when you're aware of your own triggers and also the things that get you through, you manage yourself better in a relationship. And then you've got that social awareness, because you're becoming aware of what other people are experiencing as well, or what you're sensing. And all of that together you use to effectively manage relationships. And in this place, you know, in this situation, workplace relationships. And how that can't contribute to the bottom line, I don't know, you know, I don't know how you couldn't argue it, because when you're in relationship with people and you feel safe with them and you understand what their strengths are and also the things that really set them off, you can compensate for that, right?
Yeah.
And you can,
Yeah.
you can build a team, um, with different kinds of strengths that really can move an initiative forward.
Yeah. I think I've always thought that that's so fascinating because I think historically, as we look at sort of the workplace, and if you say you take 100% of the workforce, there's always been this notion that there's 20% of those folks that are doing 80% of the work.
Yeah.
And and the sort of way that people thought about that was those are just the people that work hard and they got their things together and they're ready to go. But maybe that 80% of people, maybe they're dealing with stuff,
Yeah.
or they just they're not in the right environment, or there's something that's
Yes.
kind of tamping that down a little bit. And the
Yes.
fact that they're able to operate at the level they're able to operate is
Yes.
remarkable.
Yes.
And so I've heard a lot about this idea of you want to bring your best self to work and unlock and unleash the potential of humans, which I appreciate. And this conversation really makes me think about that if we can explore that a little bit with folks, or maybe help people sort of understand how they can manage that, and make room for them to manage that, the opportunity cost is it's astronomical. I mean, our
Yes.
ability to be able to really engage people
Yeah.
is
And
going to be,
retain them, right?
yes.
I can absolutely give an example of this. So I'm located in Camden, New Jersey, which is a very poor city, and a lot of concentrated urban poverty, a lot of racial disparity, and and there is an organization in the city that hires a lot of people. They pride themselves on hiring a lot of people who are coming out of concentrated urban poverty, um, and it's great to have that job. But I've mentored a couple of young people who have worked for that organization, and one comes to mind. She had a position where she initially was doing really well. She was making $17 an hour. I remember one time, because she had grown up with a lot of adversity, and she actually texted me and said, "I finally feel stable in my life," and which is just huge,
Remarkable.
right? And also you can tell she's one of my proteges, because who would use that word? But anyway, but then I got the really sad news that she all of a sudden, boom, lost her job. And it had been after a year and a half. She had actually won an award. Her coworkers loved her. She would tell me stories about how people would ask for her to come work in their area, that kind of thing. And what had happened was two things. One, she had a close personal relationship fall apart, and it was in the middle of the night one night, and so she did a forbidden thing, which was call out on a weekend. And then the second one was she wasn't keeping up with all of the online training that you had to do, but there really wasn't time to do it at work. And one of the classic signs of poverty is lack of Wi-Fi in your home, or lack of a computer, right? I mean, I've got kids that from Urban Promise who did their entire college applications on their cell phones, so that's the life of poverty, right? So for those two reasons, she lost her job. And I have connections at this organization, so I was able to verify this, that was the case. All I could think of was, if you want to be an organization that's hiring people and you want to kind of give them a leg up, what about having something like restorative justice? What about saying, okay, yeah, you messed up, have consequences for it, but does it have to be so final as firing? Or could there be an avenue of, yeah, you can't work for 2 months. Here's an opportunity to address this, and maybe have mentoring in that, because this kid really, she has amazing communication skills, and she really wanted to do well. I'm sorry to say that her life has just gone majorly downhill because of that loss,
Yeah.
And then another situation is things like healthcare. I had another young woman. Her father is works full time, and he has diabetes. His copay on insurance was $400. So he took a second job to pay for his insulin, but he couldn't keep it up because he's got major heart issues. And so as a result, he's had like 3 more heart you know um, little heart attacks. And I just think, I mean, when you do the math um, for hiring people, New Jersey's trying to get up to $15 an hour. Even if you make $15 an hour, you're going to make $31,000 a year. They just had an article in out of Philadelphia across the river that said that if you're living inner city, you have got to make $70,000 a year just to stop constantly relying on your family and friends to get by. And so, I realize that would be jumping into a whole nother conversation, but when employees see that you at least recognize, in healthcare we call it social determinants of health, that those outside critical pieces like housing and medicine and clothing and food and transportation and childcare. And then when you recognize that a lot of people, that if you're trying to get first generation people out of poverty, they've grown up in deeply toxic stress, but they're also incredibly resilient, and they can be so loyal, and they'll be deeply protective of your organization if you meet them where they are, And so ultimately ends up being that famous trauma-informed question, which is, instead of asking, when you see something you don't understand, what's wrong with you, it's asking what happened to you. And then also the resilience pieces and what got you through it.
Yeah.
And when you can name that and affirm that, all these walls go down, and you make connections, and you start understanding. And there are things that you can see that maybe you could do, and there are also things that you could say, yeah, no, we can't deal with, but at least you're on a more even playing ground, and you're
Yeah.
naming what's really going on.
I think what's so great about what you're saying is that as we're talking about making a more inclusive workforce or workplace, that inclusion means so many different things, and it requires us to have room for whatever people have gone through. And I was talking to another gentleman, Isaiah Zamparia, and he was talking about this idea of, we need in organizations to shift our definition of what good looks like, because when up till now, or up till recently, good looked a certain way, right? You worked whatever 80 hours and did this thing and hit all these KPIs, and all your customers looked like you and sounded like you. But the world doesn't operate like that, and it doesn't look like that. And those people that live paycheck to paycheck, or they struggle with whatever, they actually have remarkable coping skills.
Mm-hmm.
And I did this really big project at AT&T, and we talked a lot about the fact that those people that are making $15 or $17 an hour, they have the most remarkable financial budgeting skills,
Mm-hmm.
because they have to make the dollar stretch in a way that many of us have never had to do. And so they're coping with things that we've never had to cope with before.
Yep.
But it's our definition of what does good look like, or what is right, or what's acceptable, that kind of gets in our way.
Yeah.
And I think that the other thing that it makes me think about is, in our workplaces, we often have sort of one, like a cookie cutter way of thinking about, this is how we're going to deal with all of these issues, right? Sort of emotional, or family related, or what have you. It's all going to go in this bucket. And if anything sort of steps out of that, then we're not going to deal with that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's just, it's, first of all, it's enlightening, and it's just refreshing to hear that there is actual science to kind of help us begin
Yeah.
to learn about that. So in the time that we have left, I'm just curious. So let's say we spark somebody's interest and they're like, I got to learn more about what these people are talking about. So where can folks learn a little bit more about this conversation about resiliency and being trauma informed and all that sort of thing? Where would you suggest them or point them to look?
Wow. Well, trauma informed, I can rattle off a bunch of resources. There's a national forum that has tons of information on it, called acesconnection.com. And there's another one that's probably a little more simple. It's called ACES Too High. ACES stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So it's ACESTOOHIGH.com.
Okay.
Which is a great, easy way to dip your toe into it. A couple books I really like, Childhood Disrupted by Donna Jackson Nakazawa, that was published in 2015. Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, phenomenal book. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is California's first Surgeon General, and she is one of the leading trauma experts in the country, goes around speaking, has an amazing TED Talk. So Nadine Burke-Harris, and she wrote a book called The Deepest Well that has to do with trauma-informed care for children. So those are some resources for that. And they say that resiliency overcomes trauma. And so that's the real link between trauma and resiliency. Harvard does a lot of work around resiliency. I was doing a little bit of a literature search before we spoke, to find articles about workplace resiliency. And it's something that's being called for. There's a call out for it. But I didn't find that many actual research articles around it. So I thought that was interesting. Sandy Bloom has written a number of books, which actually right now, I hate to say that the title is escaping me, but she's written 3 books about the workplace. And she's got some fascinating language around the importance of workplace relationships and the damage that can be done, when it's not healthy. Yeah, so those are some resources.
That's awesome. And maybe what we can do too is maybe you can think about it a little bit more and just shoot me a note with some of those things on there, and then we can make that available to folks. But I love that idea of is it Nancy Burke-Harris? Is that
Nadine Burke-Harris? Nadine Burke-Harris.
Yeah, the first Surgeon General of California.
Yes, and she actually, her first big initiative was she got legislation passed that so every child in California will be screened for childhood adversity. And they teach parents about childhood adversity, just like they say cover up the electric plugs. You should also, know that maybe the way that you were raised, maybe there are some patterns that now that we know what we know would benefit from being changed. So really good language there. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And then I think the other thing that I want to make sure that we'll let people know is we'll make sure that they let them know what your website is. Because I think there's a lot of good information out there as well. And maybe they can contact you directly if they have any questions or anything like that, or would like your help. I hope that would be okay.
Oh yeah, no, that'd be cool.
Awesome.
I'm on a mission to raise awareness.
I know,
so,
and I know you're working at that all the time, and I appreciate the difference that you're making. So Becky, thanks a lot for your time. All right, you guys. So thank you for being here today on the Future of Work webcast at ChangeNerd. Again, my name's Anil Saxena. I am your humble master of ceremonies. If you have questions or you want to talk a little bit more about this topic or suggest some other topics, you can contact me here on ChangeNerd on LinkedIn or at my website at www.cube214.com. And don't forget to check out ChangeNerd Premium, where you can get lots of great resources and tools that are only available there. So Becky, thanks again. It's always good to
Thank
talk
you.
to you.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you too.
Right on. All right, everybody. Thanks.